Burmese pythons have done unprecedented damage to the ecosystem in South Florida, and experts say these invasive snakes continue to move farther north.
The population of pythons in the Everglades has dramatically dropped.
It's not just about the giant snakes anymore. There is something else out there, something invisible, and it is changing the rules of the jungle.
Florida's swamps have always been full of surprises, with strange discoveries appearing when people least expect them. But this time, something caught on camera is getting far more attention than usual. New footage has just been released, and the images have left viewers stunned, with many wondering if they are looking at something truly extraordinary.
These pythons have been, eating rabbits and other small mammals and other reptiles and, smaller alligators.
The clip is spreading fast, and people everywhere are trying to figure out what it really shows and why it matters so much. Did this camera capture something that changes the story completely? Join us as we explore the new footage released from Florida's swamps.
Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades.
The camera that caught nature fighting back. A trail camera sat 6 feet up a cypress tree in Big Cypress National Preserve. Researchers placed it there to watch how Burmese pythons moved through the wetlands. They wanted to understand the snake's behavior, not just to see predation. For 6 weeks, the camera recorded everything that passed by. Then someone checked the footage. The video showed a 25-pound bobcat dragging the decapitated body of a 50-pound python. The python's head was gone. The bobcat had targeted it first. This single piece of footage meant something remarkable had happened. For 20 years, pythons had been untouchable killers in Florida. Nothing hunted them, nothing could kill them, but this bobcat had done exactly that. Keep watching because this footage revealed something scientists never thought they'd see. Florida's ecosystem was fighting back against the invaders. What made the footage remarkable was what it revealed about learning. The bobcat didn't attack the python like an animal with instinct. It looked like an animal that had learned something new through experience. It approached carefully, studied the snake, and waited for the right moment. Then it made its move decisively, striking at the head where the snake was most vulnerable. This was not instinct passed down through generations. This was learning. This was a bobcat that had figured out how to kill something that should have been far too dangerous. The bobcat was maybe 5 times smaller than the python, yet it won. The cat had learned a technique, and that technique was the difference between dinner and being dinner. Scientists who reviewed the footage understood they were watching evolution in real time. A native predator was adapting to a new threat that was developing new hunting techniques. The behavioral change was happening in real time. More trail cameras throughout the swamps captured similar events. Alligators attacking small pythons in coordinated ways, panthers stalking them through the sawgrass with calculated patience, bobcats hunting in groups. Every camera showed native animals using strategy and memory. The ecosystem was not just passively suffering the invasion, it was actively learning how to fight back. The footage from that single cypress tree sparked a conversation across the scientific community. If native predators could adapt this fast, maybe the Everglades had a chance. But the conversation also included warnings. Adaptation was happening, but was it happening fast enough? The pythons were still multiplying, the parasite was still spreading, time was running out. The question became urgent. Would native species learn to hunt pythons faster than the pythons killed everything else? That trail camera footage became the face of the fight for the Everglades. Environmental groups used it in fundraising. Media outlets replayed it endlessly. Scientists presented it in conferences. A single piece of footage showing a bobcat dragging a dead python became the symbol of hope that Florida's ecosystem could recover. The footage proved that the impossible was possible. Native animals could kill pythons, native animals could adapt, and native animals could learn. The ecosystem wasn't dead, it was fighting. The symbolic weight of that video was enormous. 2 decades of python dominance in the Everglades had ended. Native animals were learning to hunt them. Predators that should have been easy prey were becoming hunters. The swamp was adapting. The swamp was fighting. Hunters working in the swamps told stories that revealed the true difficulty of the task. They would spend entire days moving slowly through thick sawgrass. They would look for any indication of a python, a scale caught on a branch, a depression in the mud showing where a snake had rested, vegetation patterns that seemed slightly off, a color that didn't quite match the surroundings. Sometimes they would spot a python immediately. Other times they'd search for days and find nothing. The swamps covered vast territory. The snakes were hidden. They were camouflaged perfectly. They were silent. They did not move. They waited. Finding them was detective work combined with survival skills combined with patience that most people couldn't summon. The adaptation of the snakes themselves became a serious problem. In areas where hunters worked regularly, the pythons seemed to learn to avoid those areas. They moved deeper into the swamp where humans rarely went. They hid in places that were almost impossible for a person to access. They learned the rhythm of human activity and stayed hidden when people were around. This suggested something remarkable about python intelligence. These were not mindless reptiles. They were learning animals that could adapt their behavior based on experience. They remembered where danger came from. They avoided it. The challenge of finding 300,000 snakes in 1.5 million acres of wetland started to seem impossible. The snakes had advantages. They were small enough to hide anywhere. They were fast enough to move to safety. They were cold-blooded, so they didn't generate heat that sensors could detect. They had no natural enemies evolved to hunt them. They reproduced constantly. Every female python laid dozens of eggs. Every egg that hatched was a new predator. Every python removed just made space for new snakes to move in from areas that hadn't been hunted yet. The dead python in that footage represented something far larger than one snake's death. It represented hope, the possibility that nature could recover and that evolution is happening fast enough to matter. But before the Everglades could fight back against the pythons, it had to understand how the snakes arrived in the first place. Scientists who saw the footage immediately understood its importance. This was evidence of a fundamental shift. Trail cameras throughout the Everglades started capturing similar footage. Alligators attacking juvenile pythons, bobcats hunting adult snakes in coordinated ways that suggested intelligence and learning, panthers stalking them through the sawgrass. Every camera showed the same pattern of native animals adapting to hunt pythons. The ecosystem wasn't surrendering, it was fighting back. The timeline led back to 1992. That's when everything started going wrong. In August 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida as a Category 5 hurricane. The wind speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour. Buildings that had stood for decades collapsed. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Near Homestead, a reptile breeding facility sat in the storm's path. The facility housed Burmese pythons that were being bred for the pet trade. The hurricane's winds smashed the building. The roof came off. The enclosures that held the dangerous snakes broke open. The pythons slithered out into the chaos. Some got away into the surrounding wetlands. Some tried to hide. Some were killed by flying debris. But enough escaped to establish a breeding population. Nobody knew exactly how many pythons got away that day. The hurricane created chaos. Counting escaping snakes was impossible. The number could have been dozens. It could have been hundreds. Scientists still debate this, but the exact number didn't matter. Even a small number was enough. A few breeding pairs were all that the Everglades needed to create a disaster. At the exact same time, Hurricane Andrew was accidentally releasing pythons. Something else was happening across South Florida. Thousands of people were intentionally releasing pet pythons. People had bought them as pets when they were small. A baby python is cute and manageable, but pythons grow fast. A snake that is 2 feet long becomes 6 feet long within a couple of years. A 6-foot python becomes 12 feet. At 12 feet, a python is dangerous. It's too large to handle safely. It eats too much. It needs too much space. Owners who couldn't manage them anymore decided to release them. They thought they were setting the snakes free. They believed they were being humane. In reality, they were introducing an apex predator into an ecosystem that had never encountered anything like it. The Everglades received these pythons like a welcome gift. The wetland covers 1.5 million acres. The temperature stays warm year-round, humidity stays high, and food is everywhere. Native animals had no defenses against pythons. Raccoons did not know how to avoid them. Opossums had never encountered a predator that size. Deer and small mammals had zero evolutionary experience with snakes that grew to 15 feet. The pythons found a paradise. They reproduced rapidly. Females laid 50 to 100 eggs per clutch. They incubated the eggs like birds do. Within a few years, estimates suggested there were tens of thousands of pythons in South Florida. Within 2 decades, scientists estimated 100,000 to 300,000 pythons in the Everglades. And as we'll reveal further, the number was almost impossible to believe. The collapse of everything native. Research teams from the University of Florida and the U.S. Geological Survey started documenting what the pythons were doing to native animals. The numbers they found were devastating. Raccoons declined by 99.3%. Opossums dropped by 98.9%. Bobcats fell by 87.5%. These weren't small declines. These were extinctions in all but name. In some areas of the Everglades, native mammals simply ceased to exist. Scientists described driving roads at night that once had 50 or more mammals visible per 2-hour drive. Their headlights would catch eyes in the darkness. Animals would move across the road. The wildlife was abundant. Then the pythons arrived, the numbers dropped, and visibility dropped. Researchers drove for hours through areas that once teemed with life and saw absolutely nothing. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of an ecosystem losing essential parts of itself. The discovery of the parasite changed the entire equation of the crisis. It was not just about removing pythons anymore. That had been the goal. Remove the pythons and the ecosystem recovers. But the parasite destroyed that simple solution. Even if every python disappeared tomorrow, the parasite would remain. It would keep infecting native snakes. It would keep killing them. The parasite had become established, creating a self-sustaining cycle in Florida's ecosystem. Native snakes ate infected frogs. The parasites spread to new snakes, and the new snakes got infected. The cycle continued. You could not stop it by removing pythons. Scientists started testing wild snakes throughout Florida to understand the spread. Every snake they examined in areas where pythons were common seemed to carry the parasite or show signs of infection. The parasite was spreading north from South Florida. It was moving through native snake populations like a disease. Some researchers described it as a plague. Others called it a catastrophe. Researchers tried to understand transmission better. They studied the cockroach to frog to snake pathway. They looked for ways to interrupt the cycle. But the parasite was already so widespread that intervention seemed nearly impossible. You couldn't stop cockroaches from eating feces, stop frogs from eating cockroaches, or prevent snakes from eating frogs. The cycle was unstoppable. The threat to the ecosystem multiplied beyond simple calculation. Not only were pythons eating the mammals, but now parasites were killing the snakes. The food web was being attacked from every angle simultaneously. Creatures that fed on snakes were losing their food supply. Creatures that competed with snakes for resources suddenly had less competition, but they also faced parasite infection. The entire system was being destabilized faster than it could adapt. Scientists who had worked in the Everglades for decades said they had never seen an ecological disaster develop this fast and this broadly. The combination of predation and parasitic infection was unprecedented. The mammals that disappeared weren't on the edges of the food web. They were foundational. Raccoons dispersed seeds, opossums cycled nutrients. Small mammals were food for larger predators, Their loss destroyed the pyramid of life. Apex predators that depended on them starved or moved away. The entire system collapsed from the bottom up. The Everglades wasn't just losing animals. It was losing the relationships between animals that made an ecosystem function. Florida's government had to respond. Something needed to be done before the pythons spread beyond the Everglades. They organized the Python Challenge again in 2016. It was a competition. Hunters and fishermen could compete to catch and remove pythons. They would spend time in the swamps looking for snakes. They would hunt them. The state would track how many they removed. In 2024, the challenge removed 195 pythons. That sounds impressive until you do the math. 195 snakes out of an estimated population of 100,000 to 300,000 is about 0.065%. It's essentially nothing. It's like trying to bail out a boat using a teaspoon while the hole in the bottom keeps getting bigger. Florida hired professional python hunters full-time starting in 2017. Donna Khalil became one of the most famous. She could find pythons that ordinary people wouldn't see. She spent entire days moving slowly through thick vegetation. She looked for any sign: a scale caught on a branch, a depression in the mud, vegetation patterns that suggested a body underneath. Sometimes she found pythons immediately. Other times, she searched for days and found nothing. The swamps were vast. The snakes were masters at hiding. Finding them was detective work combined with survival skills. Professional hunters removed 23,000 pythons since 2017. That sounds like significant progress. It's actually less than 5% of the estimated population. The snakes keep reproducing. They keep laying eggs. Every snake removed gets replaced by new snakes hatching from eggs hidden throughout the wetlands. The hunters call the snakes hunting ghosts. You might walk right past a python coiled in sawgrass without seeing it. Or you'd see what looked like a shadow in the vegetation. You'd look closer. The shadow would resolve into a snake as thick as a telephone pole. The snakes were there. They just weren't visible. Scientists tried technology to solve the problem. Thermal imaging drones could see warm bodies in darkness. But pythons are cold-blooded. Their body temperature matches the air around them. A thermal drone can't see something that isn't warmer than the background. Mechanical prey decoys seemed like they might work. Make a robot animal that moves like food. Maybe pythons would strike it and reveal themselves. But pythons don't chase prey. They wait for prey to come to them. They ignored the mechanical decoys completely. Then researchers tried something different. A scientist named Ian Bartoszek figured out that male pythons gathered with females during breeding season. If he could track a male python, he could find the females. So researchers implanted GPS trackers inside, captured male pythons, and released them back into the wild. They followed the transmitter signals. They found breeding aggregations. They located and killed some of the largest breeding females in the Everglades. This approach worked, but it was labor-intensive. You could only track a handful of snakes at a time, and the surviving pythons were learning. They were avoiding areas where humans hunted them regularly. They were withdrawing to deeper parts of the swamps. The snakes were adapting. They were learning where the danger was. The pythons were getting smarter about survival. The battle that had seemed one-sided was becoming more complicated. Then a second threat arrived, and everything became far worse than anyone had imagined. Just when it seemed like the Python Challenge and professional hunters might make a difference, scientists discovered that the pythons had brought something else with them from Asia, and that would prove even harder to stop than the snakes themselves. The parasite that came inside the snakes. Scientists discovered a parasite called Raleatiella orientalis. It was a lungworm from Southeast Asia. In Asia, pythons had evolved alongside this parasite for thousands of years. Asian pythons carried it without getting sick. They were carriers. The parasite lived in their bodies without causing problems. But when the parasite arrived in Florida inside the pythons, something different happened. It started spreading to native snakes. The transmission worked like this. Python feces contained parasite larvae. Cockroaches ate the feces and got infected. Frogs ate the cockroaches and got infected. Native Florida snakes ate the frogs and got infected. Once inside the native snakes, the larvae bored through their stomachs. They migrated into the lungs, reproduced, and filled up the airways. The native snakes suffocated slowly over weeks as the parasites took over their breathing system. Native snakes died because they had no evolutionary experience with this parasite. Their bodies didn't know how to fight it. A parasitologist named Melissa Miller from the University of Florida started testing native snakes. She found the parasite in 18 different species of Florida snakes. She found it in snakes as far north as Jacksonville, hundreds of miles from where the pythons had been released. The parasite had established itself in native Florida snakes. It could now spread on its own. Even if Florida managed to remove every python from the state, the parasite would keep killing native snakes. The damage was permanent. The swamp was now fighting on two fronts, against the pythons and against the parasite. The Everglades wasn't just a nice place to visit. It was critical infrastructure for millions of people. The wetland filtered water that recharged the aquifers supplying drinking water to cities throughout South Florida. It slowed down hurricane storm surge. It prevented flooding. Scientists calculated that the Everglades provided services worth more than $31 billion every year. When pythons destroyed the mammal populations, they didn't just hurt animals. They hurt the entire system that provided water and flood protection to millions of people. The small mammals the pythons ate weren't minor players. They dispersed seeds for plants. They cycled nutrients through the soil. They were food for other predators. Their loss collapsed the foundational structure of the ecosystem. At the same time, the parasite attacked from the bottom. It didn't just kill pythons. It infected native snakes that had never had exposure to it. Those snakes weren't adapted to fight it. The combination of these two threats created what scientists called a two-front catastrophe. The ecosystem was being attacked from above and below simultaneously. Pythons killed mammals. The parasite killed reptiles. Both attacks destabilized different parts of the system. The Everglades couldn't survive this much damage. Some native snakes started dying without anyone understanding why. Field researchers would find bodies and run tests. The parasite was there. But why did some snakes survive and others didn't? Why did some populations seem resistant? A group of Florida cottonmouths showed unusually low parasite loads even in areas heavily infected. Somehow, these snakes were resisting the parasite better than others. Scientists didn't know why. Was it genetics? Immune system adaptation? Behavior? The cottonmouth data offered hope. It suggested that Florida snakes might develop resistance, but it also raised difficult questions. How long would it take them to develop resistance? Could they develop it fast enough to avoid extinction? Florida's government and conservation groups didn't just sit back and accept the invasion. They started a bold restoration program. The plan was ambitious: reintroduce an animal that had been wiped out 50 years earlier. The eastern indigo snake was the longest native snake in North America. It could grow to 8 feet long. More importantly, it ate other snakes. It had venom immunity, which meant it could hunt venomous snakes without dying. Best of all, it would eat pythons. Juvenile pythons anyway. Scientists weren't sure if an indigo snake could kill an adult 15-foot python. But small pythons? Absolutely. The indigos would hunt them. The problem was that indigo snakes needed a specific habitat. They needed gopher tortoise burrows to hide in. Those tortoise burrows had mostly disappeared because the longleaf pine forests where the tortoises lived had been logged and destroyed. So conservationists had to rebuild the habitat first. Organizations like the Oriane Society worked to restore longleaf pine flatwoods. they re-established gopher tortoise colonies. Only then could they reintroduce the indigos. They released captive-bred indigo snakes into the restored habitat. For years, researchers watched and waited. Then in late 2023, trail cameras captured something remarkable. A juvenile indigo snake, not one that humans had released, one that had been born in the wild. The parents had reproduced. The snake had survived its first year. It was the first wild-born indigo snake in over 50 years. The reintroduction was working. Native predators were returning. Trail cameras captured other predators hunting pythons too. Alligators ambushed small pythons. Florida panthers stalked and attacked them. Bobcats, as the original footage showed, had learned to target the head. Native predators were learning python vulnerabilities. Pythons digest slowly. In cold weather, they become sluggish. Their heads are fragile compared to their massive bodies. Over time, native predators were figuring out how to hunt the invaders. The ecosystem wasn't passive. It was actively fighting back. But would the fight come fast enough? The Everglades needed help. It needed humans to understand what was happening and act fast. Conservation groups and the Florida government decided they would fight back using an animal that hadn't been seen in the wild for 50 years. Would the snakes and panthers and bobcats adapt before the parasite killed all the native reptiles? Keep watching. There's more. The battle continues, and the ending nobody can predict. The situation in Florida's swamps remained uncertain. Pythons kept spreading. The parasite kept circulating through native snakes. But removal programs kept hunting. Tracking technology kept locating breeding females. And native predators kept learning to hunt the invaders. It was an ongoing battle with no clear victor. Scientists monitored the situation constantly, looking for any sign that one side or the other was gaining ground. The cottonmouth data offered hope, but also mystery. These snakes showed resistance to the parasite even when heavily exposed. If scientists could understand why, they might be able to help other species develop the same resistance. But understanding took time. Research moved slowly. Meanwhile, the parasite spread and native snakes died. Researchers raced to understand the mechanism before species went extinct. Every day that passed without answers was another day the parasite spread further through the native snake population. The indigo snake reintroduction program had achieved something amazing, but the snakes were still vulnerable. They needed to establish a larger population before they could truly help control pythons. And the parasite threat loomed. If the parasite infected indigos, the entire restoration project could collapse. Scientists watched the indigos carefully, testing them for parasite infection, hoping the resistance mechanisms that protected them would hold. Nobody had ever observed an adult indigo snake fighting a 15-foot, 150-pound python. If that encounter ever happened, nobody knew who would win. The indigos could control juveniles, but adults? That remained unknown. The professional hunters continued their work. Every year, more pythons were removed, but the removal rate never caught up with reproduction. Donna Khalil and others like her became more skilled. They learned where pythons hid. They understood python behavior better. But even with improved skills, they couldn't remove enough snakes to control the population. The task was simply too large. The swamps were too vast. The snakes were too numerous. The python challenge continued annually. More pythons were caught. But the challenge was partly symbolic. It showed that Floridians refused to give up. It created a culture of python hunting. It raised awareness. It motivated people to care about the ecosystem. But it didn't solve the problem. 195 snakes out of hundreds of thousands was a gesture, not a solution. Scientists placed more trail cameras throughout the swamps. Cameras recorded predator-prey interactions constantly. Researchers analyzed the footage. They documented which native predators were successfully hunting pythons. They measured how often predation events occurred. Slowly, a picture emerged of an ecosystem adapting. It wasn't happening fast. It wasn't happening at the scale needed. But it was happening. Native species were learning to hunt the invaders. The Everglades was fighting for its survival. The uncertainty was overwhelming. The scientific community remained divided about what would eventually happen. Some researchers believed native predators would eventually control the python population given enough time. The adaptation rate was faster than anyone had predicted. If it continued at its current pace, native species might be able to reduce python numbers to manageable levels within a decade or two. Others warned that the parasite threat made this unlikely. Even if predators controlled pythons, the parasite would continue spreading through native snakes. The ecosystem would face a new equilibrium where pythons were fewer, but native species were decimated by parasitic infection. The most optimistic scenario involved complete restoration. Native predator populations would rebound substantially. The parasite would somehow be controlled or eradicated. The Everglades would return to pre-python conditions. But this scenario required that multiple things go right simultaneously. Indigo snakes had to establish successfully, cottonmouths had to spread their parasite resistance, removal programs had to continue funding and support, predator adaptation had to accelerate. The probability of all these things happening together was low, but not zero. The pessimistic scenario involved the python invasion becoming permanent. Python populations would spread throughout the southeastern United States. The parasite would establish in native species everywhere pythons spread. Ecosystems across the region would experience the same collapse that Florida was experiencing. Entire predator populations would disappear. Food webs would be disrupted. The damage would be permanent. Humans would have to accept that Florida's native ecosystems had been fundamentally and irreversibly changed. Nobody could predict whether the ecosystem would recover. The pythons might continue spreading until they covered the entire southeastern United States. The parasite might spread through native snake populations and cause extinction. Or native predators might adapt fast enough to control the pythons. The parasite might find hosts that developed resistance. The indigo snake restoration might succeed. Humans might develop better removal technology. Some combination of these factors might create a new equilibrium where pythons remained, but native species survived alongside them. The Everglades stood at a crossroads. Multiple forces pushed in different directions. The pythons pushed toward domination. The parasite pushed toward killing native reptiles. Removal programs pushed toward population control. Native predators pushed toward adaptation and recovery. The indigo snakes pushed toward restoration. The cottonmouths pushed toward resistance. All these forces interacted in ways that nobody could fully predict. The outcome depended on which forces moved faster, which adaptation came first, and which population stabilized or crashed. The answer existed somewhere in the future. Researchers continued their work. They placed more cameras. They tracked more snakes. They tested more native animals for parasite infection. They released more indigos. They hunted more pythons. Every action was an attempt to tip the balance toward the native ecosystem. Every action was a plea for nature to evolve fast enough. It acknowledged that the battle was real and ongoing, and the footage released from the trail cameras showed a swamp that wasn't surrendering. Native animals were fighting back. The ecosystem wasn't giving up, but whether the natives could actually win remained unknown. The swamps would decide. Nature would determine the outcome. Only time would reveal who prevailed in this invasion that nobody had invited, but everyone now had to contend with. The battle for Florida's Everglades continued, and the ending remained to be written. The trail cameras kept recording. The footage kept showing the struggle. Every video was a piece of evidence in an ongoing court case nature was conducting against itself. Would time run out? The answer existed somewhere in the future. The Everglades in 2026 looked nothing like the Everglades of 2006. the Everglades of 2036 would look nothing like the Everglades of 2026. Change was constant. The question was whether the changes would allow life to persist or whether they would mean extinction and collapse. What do you think? Could Florida's native predators adapt quickly enough to turn the tide against one of the largest invasive species crises in modern history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.